But Britain's most talked about academic, Professor Matthew Goodwin, whose Substack articles at mattgoodwin.org rail against the woke takeover of our public institutions, has sparked a major debate online with the following tweet. He tweeted the following: in case you've not noticed, the entire point of Brexit, to build a different economy, is being dumped. Both left and right are now fully committed to mass cheap migration to keep businesses happy, to keep wages low, downward pressure on lower paid British workers, and weakening their bargaining power and distorting the market. So is mass migration a price worth paying for economic growth, or are the current numbers of net migration, most recently 600,000 in a year, a race to the bottom for the country and a betrayal of Brexit? Well, I'm delighted to say the aforementioned Professor Matthew Goodwin joins me now. And Matthew, isn't high immigration good for economic growth? What's not to like?
Well, look, everybody wants a strong economy, Mark, but the economy is not the end. The economy is also here to serve the rest of us, to build stable communities, to contribute to the good life. What we've got in Britain at the moment, I'm afraid, is a political economy which is really geared towards serving the elite and ignoring everybody else. What we're seeing now are leaders on both the left and the right continuing to import cheap migrant labour rather than invest in British.
Could these high figures of migration, Matthew, be considered a Brexit betrayal? Now, we've just lost the line to Matthew there. We're going to reconnect with Matthew very shortly, the vagaries of an internet Zoom conversation. What do you think about this idea of net migration being at 600,000? There are many technocrats who would argue it's directly linked to higher growth. It's all about the economy. But then where do you get the GP surgeries and the hospitals and the schools from? I'm delighted to say Matthew Goodwin is back. And Matthew, I'm pleased that you've put 10p in the meter. Could these high figures of net migration be considered a Brexit betrayal?
Absolutely. Most of the people who voted for Brexit wanted lower immigration, not the continuation of mass immigration. So what we're seeing here is essentially the Conservative Party selling out that Brexit project, Mark, and refusing to do what many voters wanted, which was to build a different political economy which invests in British workers. Look, what's going on at the moment is nothing short of scandalous. Both left and right are ignoring what millions of people voted for, and this will have political consequences. It might not be necessarily a new party on the right of the Conservatives. It might just be mass apathy, many people not voting at all because they think that actually nobody is really listening to them. But what we've got here, let's be clear, firstly is an open admission from many elite organizations that the whole point behind mass immigration is to keep wages low. So when they say things like immigration helps inflation, what they mean is immigration keeps wages low. So nice to have everybody admitting that this is what it's been about for the last 20 years. That's the first point. And the second point is that if you look at where we're going as a country in the future, we have now got an economy that is basically a bit like a drug addict, is completely addicted now to the continuation of low-skill, cheap labour, which companies and big business love because those workers tend to have less rights and they tend to be less flexible. And it means the person who gets stuffed in all of this is the average British worker. And that's why I think we need to be speaking out much more forcefully against this political economy, because it is not working for us, it is not working for Britain, and it is not working for ordinary British people.
Well, indeed, and with those levels of net migration, access to a GP, access to a school place, having a roof over your head is going to become an increasing challenge. Matthew, why have the Conservatives in particular abandoned their pledge to drastically reduce immigration?
Well, firstly, because they never really understood what Brexit was all about. Secondly, because the Conservative Parliamentary Party is largely dominated by business liberals. The donor class behind the party is dominated by business liberals. They're fully invested in continuing this economic model. They don't see slashing immigration as a priority. And to be honest, they view cultural issues as being beneath them. And this is fundamentally the big problem facing British politics, which is I don't really think we have a Conservative Party that is reflecting the needs and the aspirations and the wishes of a large majority of voters out there. The American Conservatives, Mark, as you know, have changed their position on all of these issues considerably over the last 10 years. The British Tories have failed to do so. They are in cahoots with big business, and they're in cahoots with many of their allies within the elite world, and they're not being responsive. And my big worry here, as I say, is not necessarily that, we'll have a big political insurgency per se, although I think in some respects that would be positive. My bigger worry is people just give up on the political system. I think they just basically walk away and they say, look, we've been saying for 20 years, we don't want to live in an economy shaped around cheap migrant labor. Now, is somebody in power going to listen to those people, or are they not? Because if they don't, there will be consequences.
Briefly, Matthew, do you think we're approaching a situation in which we have a uni-party where you can barely tell the difference between Labour and the Conservatives? And could that provoke a democratic crisis?
I think we do have a new consensus, Mark. I think that consensus is basically pro-high immigration, pro-globalisation, pro-London, pro-middle class, pro-net zero, pro-woke, given that the Conservatives have actually really not done that much at standing up against radical progressivism. And so I think many people are looking at left and right today a bit like they looked at them in the late 2000s or the early 2010s before Nigel Farage and the UK Independence Party took off. And I think they just see parties looking the same. I don't think they see any meaningful difference between them. I think Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer look very, very similar, with the exception of one or two minor issues. There's not really that much ideological distance between them, which is why, by the way, Mark, I think both of those parties are deeply vulnerable. I do think that if there was some kind of people's movement that was geared towards the established parties, I suspect it would be very successful. I mean, I notice in the polls that parties like Reform have been ticking upwards, reaching 8-9% in the national polls, as an example. I just think many people out there are looking at the establishment and still saying, after Brexit, after the 2019 election, you guys just don't get it.
They don't get it. Matthew Goodwin is the author of the best-selling book, Values, Voice and Virtue, and his unmissable interviews and Substack columns can be found at mattgoodwin.org. Thanks, Matt. Have a great weekend. Your reaction, mark at gbnews.com. Is net migration of 600,000 a Brexit betrayal? Let me know your thoughts.